The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez walked through the main corridor of the administrative building. Her uniform was crisp, her posture straight, but the weight of exhaustion hung heavy on her shoulders. She had just returned from a classified mission that had kept her deployed for 8 months in some of the most dangerous territories in the world. The mission was successful, but it came at a personal cost that few would ever understand. Sarah was one of only a handful of women who had successfully completed Navy SEAL training. The path to get there had been brutal, not just because of the physical demands, but because of the constant skepticism and outright hostility she faced from those who believed women had no place in special operations. Even now, after proving herself countless times in combat, she still encountered those who saw her as nothing more than a political statement or a diversity hire. As she made her way to the personnel office to complete her post-deployment paperwork, Sarah noticed a group of junior officers gathered near the coffee station. Their voices carried across the hallway, and she could hear fragments of their conversation. They were discussing the recent changes in military policy regarding women in combat roles, and their tone suggested they were not supporters of the progress being made. "I still can't believe they're letting women into the teams now," one of them said, shaking his head. "It's going to get people killed." "Exactly," another chimed in. "They're lowering standards just to make some politicians happy. Real operators are going to suffer because of it." Sarah kept walking, choosing not to engage. She had heard these conversations before, and she knew that responding would only escalate the situation. Her record spoke for itself, and she didn't need to justify her presence to every skeptic she encountered. But, as she passed the group, one of the officers noticed her. "Hey, look who it is," the first officer said, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "The poster girl for political correctness." Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that these were junior officers who likely had no combat experience and certainly no understanding of what she had accomplished. She continued toward the personnel office, but the comments followed her. "I heard she got special treatment during training," another voice added. "Different standards, easier tests. Must be nice to have quotas working in your favor." The words stung, not because Sarah believed them, but because she knew how hard she had worked to overcome exactly these kinds of assumptions. She had not received special treatment during training. In fact, she had faced additional scrutiny and higher expectations than her male counterparts. Every mistake was magnified, every success was questioned, and every failure was used as evidence that women didn't belong in special operations. Sarah reached the personnel office and checked in with the clerk, but the conversation from the hallway continued to echo in her mind. She had dealt with this kind of treatment throughout her career, but it never got easier. The constant need to prove herself was exhausting, especially when she had already proven herself in ways that most of these critics never would. As she waited for her paperwork to be processed, Sarah reflected on her journey to become a Navy SEAL. Growing up in a military family, she had always been drawn to service. Her father was a Marine, her brother was in the Army, and she had known from a young age that she wanted to follow in their footsteps. But she also knew she wanted to push boundaries and challenge herself in ways that few people ever would. When the opportunity arose for women to attempt SEAL training, Sarah was among the first to volunteer. She knew the odds were against her, not just because of the physical demands, but because of the institutional resistance she would face. The training was designed to break people, to push them beyond their limits and see who had the mental and physical toughness to succeed. For women, there was an additional layer of challenge, proving that they belonged there in the first place. The initial phases of training were brutal. Sarah found herself constantly under scrutiny, with instructors and fellow candidates watching for any sign of weakness or special accommodation. She was held to the same standards as everyone else, but the pressure was magnified because she knew that her failure would be used as evidence that no woman could succeed in the program. During Hell Week, the most notorious phase of SEAL training, Sarah faced her greatest test. 7 days of almost continuous physical activity with minimal sleep and food, designed to break down candidates mentally and physically. Many of her male counterparts dropped out during this phase, but Sarah persevered. She completed every exercise, met every standard, and finished the week as one of the few candidates still standing. Even after successfully completing Hell Week, the challenges continued. Advanced training phases tested everything from underwater demolition to advanced weapons systems to complex tactical operations. Sarah excelled in many areas, particularly in marksmanship and tactical planning, where her attention to detail and analytical mind gave her an advantage. But perhaps her greatest strength was her ability to remain calm under pressure. During a particularly challenging exercise that simulated a hostage rescue situation, Sarah's team found themselves facing a scenario that had gone wrong. Equipment failures and unexpected complications had turned what should have been a straightforward operation into a potential disaster. While other team members began to panic, Sarah maintained her composure and developed an alternative plan that not only saved the exercise but impressed the instructors with its creativity and effectiveness. Despite these successes, Sarah continued to face skepticism from some quarters. There were whispers that the instructors were going easy on her, that the standards were being lowered, that she was receiving help that wasn't available to others. These rumors were investigated and found to be baseless, but they persisted nonetheless. The worst part wasn't the physical challenges or even the institutional resistance. It was the constant questioning of her motivations and abilities. Some suggested that she was only there for the publicity, that she was part of some political agenda rather than a genuine warrior who wanted to serve her country. Others implied that she was taking a spot that should have gone to a man, that her presence made the entire team weaker. Sarah endured these challenges because she believed in what she was doing. She knew that breaking barriers was never easy, and she understood that her success or failure would impact other women who might follow in her footsteps. But, more than that, she genuinely loved the work. The complexity of special operations, the need for precise planning and flawless execution, the opportunity to serve in the most challenging environments, all of these aspects of SEAL operations appealed to her. When she finally graduated from training and received her SEAL Trident, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and relief. She had proven that she belonged, that she could meet the standards, and that she could contribute to the mission. But she also knew that the real test was still ahead. Training was one thing, actual combat operations were another entirely. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan, where her team was tasked with conducting reconnaissance missions and targeted raids against high-value targets. Sarah quickly proved her worth in the field, demonstrating the same skills and dedication that had gotten her through training. Her teammates, who had initially been skeptical, began to respect her abilities and trust her judgment. During one particularly dangerous mission, Sarah's quick thinking and marksmanship skills saved the lives of several team members. The team was conducting a raid on a compound believed to house a high-ranking terrorist leader when they found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah identified a sniper position that was pinning down her teammates and eliminated the threat with a single, perfectly placed shot from over 800 meters away. The successful completion of that mission earned her the respect of even her harshest critics within the special operations community. Over the following years, Sarah deployed multiple times to various theaters of operation. She participated in missions that ranged from direct action raids to complex intelligence-gathering operations. Her record was exemplary, and she earned several commendations for her performance under fire. But, despite her proven track record, she continued to face skepticism and criticism from some quarters. The most recent mission had been particularly challenging, not just tactically but personally. Sarah's team had been tasked with infiltrating a terrorist stronghold to gather intelligence on an imminent attack. The mission required months of preparation and placed the team deep in enemy territory for an extended period. The operation was successful, providing intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack, but it came at a significant cost to Sarah personally. During the mission, Sarah had been forced to make a decision that haunted her. While gathering intelligence, her team discovered that the terrorists were planning to use children as suicide bombers in their attack. Sarah had to choose between maintaining operational security and potentially saving the children. She chose to break protocol and warn local authorities, knowing that doing so might compromise the mission and put her team at risk. The decision ultimately proved correct, as the authorities were able to rescue the children and prevent the attack. But it also led to Sarah's team being discovered and having to fight their way out of enemy territory. 2 team members were wounded in the firefight, and, although they all made it home safely, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her decision had put her teammates in unnecessary danger. The debriefing after the mission was intense. Some officials questioned whether Sarah's emotional response to seeing the children in danger had clouded her tactical judgment. Others praised her for making a difficult moral choice under extreme pressure. But Sarah herself was struggling with the weight of command and the responsibility that came with making life and death decisions. Now, back at the base and completing her post-deployment paperwork, Sarah was trying to process everything that had happened during those 8 months. She was proud of what her team had accomplished, but she was also exhausted from constantly having to prove herself while dealing with the normal stresses of combat operations. The comments from the junior officers in the hallway had reopened wounds that Sarah thought had healed. After everything she had been through, after all she had proven, there were still people who saw her as nothing more than a diversity hire or a political statement. It was frustrating and demoralizing, especially when she was already dealing with the psychological aftermath of a difficult deployment. As Sarah sat in the personnel office waiting for her paperwork to be processed, she tried to focus on the positive aspects of her career. She had broken barriers and paved the way for other women to follow. She had served her country with distinction and saved lives in the process. She had proven that women could not only survive in the special operations community but thrive and contribute meaningfully to the mission. But the negative voices were sometimes louder than the positive ones, and today was one of those days when the criticism felt particularly heavy. Sarah knew she would need to find a way to deal with these feelings, perhaps through counseling or simply time to process her experiences. For now, she focused on completing the administrative requirements of her return and getting back to her normal routine. The personnel clerk called her name, and Sarah walked to the counter to collect her completed paperwork. As she reviewed the documents, she noticed that her next assignment was already listed. She would be joining a new team that was being formed to test innovative tactics and equipment. It was exactly the kind of challenging assignment that she had always sought, and it represented a vote of confidence in her abilities from the upper echelons of the Special Operations Command. Sarah smiled for the first time that day as she read the assignment details. Despite the criticism and skepticism she faced, her superiors clearly valued her contributions and wanted to put her skills to good use. The new assignment would give her the opportunity to help shape the future of special operations and continue breaking new ground for women in the military. As she left the personnel office, Sarah passed the same group of junior officers who had been talking earlier. They were still gathered around the coffee station, still discussing military policy and women in combat roles. This time, Sarah didn't try to avoid them. She walked past with confidence, her head held high, knowing that her record spoke for itself and that she had nothing to prove to people who had never been tested in the way she had been tested. One of the officers noticed her again and made another comment, but Sarah didn't hear what he said. She was already thinking about her next assignment and the challenges that lay ahead. She had work to do, barriers to break, and missions to complete. The critics would always be there, but so would the mission, and that was what truly mattered. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's return to the base, and the routine of stateside duty was beginning to feel normal again. She had settled into her new assignment with the Experimental Tactics Unit, working alongside some of the most innovative minds in special operations. The work was intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding, exactly the kind of challenge she had been looking for after her difficult deployment. The unit was housed in a separate building from the main administrative offices, which meant Sarah rarely encountered the junior officers who had been making comments about women in combat roles. This separation suited her fine, as it allowed her to focus on her work without the constant reminder of the skepticism that still existed within some corners of the military. Her new team consisted of 12 operators from various special operations units, including SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations, and Marine Raiders. The diversity of backgrounds brought different perspectives and expertise to their experimental work, which focused on developing new tactics for urban warfare and counter-terrorism operations. Sarah found herself particularly drawn to the technology integration aspects of their mission. The team was testing new communication systems, advanced surveillance equipment, and innovative weapons platforms that could give special operations forces significant advantages in future conflicts. Her analytical mind and attention to detail made her particularly effective at identifying potential problems with new systems before they could become issues in the field. During one particularly intensive training exercise, Sarah's team was testing a new drone surveillance system that was designed to provide real-time intelligence during urban operations. The system was impressive in its capabilities, but Sarah noticed that the communication protocols had a vulnerability that could potentially be exploited by sophisticated adversaries. When she brought her concerns to the team leader, Major Jackson, he was initially skeptical. The system had been developed by some of the military's top technical experts, and it had passed all previous tests. But Sarah persisted, explaining exactly how the vulnerability could be exploited and what the consequences might be in a real-world scenario. Major Jackson decided to test Sarah's theory during their next exercise. The team would attempt to exploit the vulnerability she had identified while another team defended using the new system. The results were eye-opening. Sarah's team was able to completely compromise the surveillance network within 30 minutes, effectively blinding the defending team and allowing them to complete their objective undetected. The successful demonstration of the vulnerability led to significant changes in the system's design and earned Sarah recognition from the development team. More importantly, it demonstrated once again that her contributions to special operations went beyond simply proving that women could meet the physical standards. She brought unique perspectives and analytical skills that enhanced the overall effectiveness of the team she joined. Despite these professional successes, Sarah continued to encounter reminders of the prejudice that existed within the military community. During a briefing session with representatives from various units across the base, she overheard conversations that made it clear that not everyone was comfortable with the changes happening in special operations. The briefing was being held in the main conference center, which meant that personnel from across the base were in attendance. Sarah arrived early and took a seat near the back of the room, reviewing her notes for the presentation she would be giving about the experimental tactics unit's recent findings. As the room filled up, Sarah became aware of a conversation happening behind her. A group of officers was discussing recent policy changes regarding physical fitness standards and combat roles for women. Their tone suggested they were not supportive of these changes, and their comments became increasingly disparaging. "It's all about politics now," one of them said. "They're more concerned with headlines than with actual effectiveness." "Right," another agreed. "They'll lower standards, compromise missions, whatever it takes to make the politicians happy." Sarah tried to focus on her notes, but the conversation was difficult to ignore, especially as it became more personal and specific. The officers began discussing individual cases of women in special operations, including thinly veiled references to Sarah herself. "That SEAL woman, for example," one of them said. "I heard she got through training because they didn't want to deal with the political fallout of failing her. And now she's in the experimental unit," another added. "Probably there to check boxes rather than actually contribute." Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened to the comments. These officers were talking about her professional assignment and her qualifications without knowing anything about her actual performance or contributions. They were making assumptions based purely on her gender and their own preconceptions about women in combat roles. The conversation continued with increasingly crude and personal attacks. The officers questioned not just Sarah's professional qualifications but her motivations for joining the military. They suggested that women who sought combat roles were either trying to prove something or were somehow psychologically damaged. "Normal women don't want to do this stuff," one of them said. "There's something wrong with them if they do." Sarah had heard enough. She turned around to face the group, her expression calm but her eyes flashing with controlled anger. The officers immediately fell silent as they realized she had been listening to their conversation. "Gentlemen," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make them uncomfortable. "I believe you were discussing my qualifications and motivations." The officers looked embarrassed and began to stammer apologies, claiming they hadn't meant anything personal. But Sarah wasn't interested in their excuses. She had dealt with this kind of behavior throughout her career, and she had learned that sometimes direct confrontation was the only way to address it. "I've been listening to your conversation for the past 10 minutes, Sarah continued. You've questioned my training, my assignment, and my psychological fitness for service. I'm curious about your qualifications to make such assessments." One of the officers, a captain named Morrison, tried to defend the group's comments. "We were just discussing policy implications," he said. "Nothing personal." "Really?" Sarah replied. "Because it sounded quite personal to me. You specifically mentioned me by name and made detailed assertions about my training and current assignment." The other officers in the group began to look increasingly uncomfortable. They realized they had been caught making inappropriate comments about a fellow officer, and they weren't sure how to handle the situation. Some of them had begun to recognize Sarah from various base activities and were realizing exactly who they had been talking about. "Look," Captain Morrison said, trying to take control of the situation. "We're entitled to our opinions about military policy. And we have legitimate concerns about how these changes are affecting unit readiness and effectiveness." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right that you're entitled to your opinions about policy. But, when your opinions involve specific false statements about individual officers, that crosses a line from policy discussion into something else entirely." "False statements?" Morrison challenged. "How do you know what we said was false?" Sarah smiled coldly. "Because I'm the officer you were discussing, Captain. I know exactly what my training record shows, what my performance evaluations say, and why I was assigned to the experimental tactics unit. And none of it matches what you've been saying." The revelation that they had been talking about Sarah directly to her face left the group speechless. They had assumed she was just another officer attending the briefing, not the subject of their conversation. The realization that she had heard every word of their discussion made the situation exponentially more awkward and potentially problematic for them. Morrison tried to salvage the situation. "We didn't realize you were listening. We certainly didn't mean any disrespect." "But, you did mean disrespect," Sarah replied. "You just didn't expect to be called out on it. The fact that you thought I wasn't listening doesn't change what you said or the attitudes those comments reflect." Before the conversation could continue further, the briefing began. Sarah turned back toward the front of the room, leaving the group of officers to contemplate what had just happened. She could feel their eyes on her throughout the presentation, and she knew that word of the confrontation would spread quickly through the base's informal communication networks. During the briefing, Sarah gave her presentation about the experimental tactics unit's recent findings. She spoke confidently about the vulnerabilities they had identified in various systems and the solutions they had developed to address those weaknesses. Her presentation was well received by most of the audience, and several officers approached her afterward with questions and comments about her team's work. As the briefing concluded and people began to leave, Sarah noticed that Captain Morrison and his group were lingering near the exit. She suspected they wanted to continue their conversation from earlier, possibly to clarify their statements or offer more substantial apologies. But Sarah wasn't interested in giving them the opportunity to make excuses for their behavior. Instead, she gathered her materials and headed for a different exit, avoiding the confrontation that Morrison seemed to be seeking. She had made her point during the initial exchange, and she didn't see any benefit in continuing the discussion. The officers now knew that she was aware of their attitudes and that she was prepared to defend herself against inappropriate comments. As Sarah walked back to her unit's building, she reflected on the incident and what it represented. The conversation she had overheard was probably typical of many that happened throughout the military when women in combat roles were discussed. Most of these conversations happened without the subject being present to defend themselves, which meant that false narratives and unfounded assumptions could spread without being challenged. The incident also highlighted the ongoing challenges that women in special operations faced. Even after proving themselves in training and in combat, they continued to face skepticism and criticism from colleagues who questioned their presence in these roles. Sarah realized that every woman who followed this path would likely face similar challenges until attitudes within the military culture changed more substantially. But the incident also demonstrated something positive. Sarah had been able to confront the inappropriate comments directly and effectively. She hadn't backed down or allowed the officers to dismiss their statements as harmless policy discussion. By standing up for herself, she had made it clear that such behavior had consequences and wouldn't be tolerated without response. Over the following days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how some people interacted with her on the base. Word of her confrontation with Morrison's group had indeed spread, and the reactions were mixed. Some officers seemed more respectful and professional in their interactions with her, apparently having gained a better understanding of her qualifications and accomplishments. Others, however, seemed to view her as troublesome or overly sensitive. They began to avoid her in social situations or limited their interactions to purely professional matters. Sarah realized that standing up for herself had consequences beyond just the immediate confrontation, but she also knew that allowing inappropriate behavior to go unchallenged would have had consequences as well. Major Jackson, her team leader, heard about the incident through the base's informal communication networks and asked Sarah about it during one of their regular check-in meetings. He was concerned that the confrontation might affect her ability to work effectively with other units on the base. "I heard you had some words with Morrison's crew at the briefing," Jackson said carefully. "Everything okay?" Sarah appreciated that her team leader was checking on her welfare rather than criticizing her for the confrontation. "They were making inappropriate comments about women in special operations," she explained. "I felt it was necessary to address their statements directly." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. But I want to make sure this doesn't become a distraction from our mission here. We've got important work to do, and I need to know that you can work effectively with people across the base." "I understand your concern, sir," Sarah replied. "But I also can't ignore behavior that undermines the professionalism and effectiveness of the military. If officers are making false statements about their colleagues' qualifications and assignments, that needs to be addressed." Jackson agreed with Sarah's assessment but also warned her about the potential for retaliation or escalation. The military, like any large organization, had informal power structures and communication networks that could make life difficult for someone who was seen as challenging the status quo. "Just be careful," Jackson advised. "You're an outstanding officer with a bright future ahead of you. Don't let personality conflicts derail your career." Sarah appreciated the advice, but she also knew that she couldn't allow fear of retaliation to prevent her from standing up for herself and other women in similar situations. The progress that had been made in opening combat roles to women had come about because people were willing to challenge existing attitudes and practices, even when doing so involved personal risk. As she continued her work with the Experimental Tactics Unit, Sarah found herself thinking more about the broader implications of her presence in special operations. She realized that her role went beyond just completing missions and contributing to tactical innovations. Whether she wanted it or not, she was also serving as a symbol and a representative for other women who might follow similar paths. This realization brought both pressure and motivation. Sarah knew that her successes and failures would be scrutinized more closely than those of her male colleagues, and that her behavior would be used to make judgments about women's suitability for special operations roles. But she also knew that her presence and performance were helping to change attitudes and create opportunities for others. The situation on the base had grown more tense in the weeks following Sarah's confrontation with Captain Morrison and his group. While some officers had become more respectful in their interactions with her, others seemed to view her as a troublemaker who was stirring up unnecessary conflict. The divide in attitudes was creating an uncomfortable dynamic that affected not just Sarah but the broader community of personnel on the base. Sarah continued to excel in her work with the Experimental Tactics Unit, but she found herself being more cautious in her interactions with other personnel. She was aware that her words and actions were being scrutinized more closely than before, and she didn't want to provide ammunition for those who were looking for reasons to criticize her presence in special operations. The Experimental Tactics Unit had recently been tasked with developing new protocols for multi-agency cooperation during counter-terrorism operations. The project required extensive coordination with other military units, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement organizations. Sarah's role in the project was significant, as her combat experience and analytical skills made her particularly effective at identifying potential coordination problems and developing solutions. During one of the project meetings, which included representatives from various agencies and military units, Sarah presented findings about communication protocols that could improve coordination during complex operations. Her presentation was thorough and professional, and it received positive feedback from most of the attendees. However, after the meeting, Sarah overheard Captain Morrison talking with several other officers about the presentation. His comments suggested that he was still harboring resentment about their previous confrontation and was looking for opportunities to undermine her credibility. "She talks a good game," Morrison was saying, "but I wonder how she'd perform under real pressure. It's easy to analyze operations from a conference room." One of the officers with Morrison pointed out that Sarah had extensive combat experience, including recent deployments to high-threat areas. But Morrison dismissed this information, suggesting that her missions had been less dangerous than those undertaken by male SEALs or that she had received special protection during operations. Sarah realized that Morrison was actively working to damage her reputation and credibility. His comments were becoming more persistent and more personal, and they were being shared with other officers who might not have direct knowledge of Sarah's actual record and accomplishments. The situation reached a turning point during a large briefing session that included senior officers from across the base. The briefing was focused on new developments in special operations training and tactics, and it included presentations from several units, including Sarah's experimental tactics team. Sarah was scheduled to present the unit's latest findings about urban warfare tactics when she noticed that Morrison had taken a seat near the front of the room with several other officers. Throughout the earlier presentations, Morrison had been making quiet comments to his companions, and Sarah suspected that he was planning to cause some kind of disruption during her presentation. As Sarah began her presentation, she could see Morrison whispering to the officers around him. His behavior was distracting and unprofessional, but Sarah maintained her composure and continued with her prepared remarks. She was discussing new approaches to building clearing operations when Morrison interrupted her with a question. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said loudly, causing the entire room to turn their attention to him. "I'm curious about your practical experience with these tactics. How many actual building clearing operations have you personally conducted?" The question was clearly designed to challenge Sarah's credibility and suggest that her recommendations were based on theory rather than practical experience. Sarah could feel the tension in the room as everyone waited to see how she would respond to the obvious provocation. "Captain Morrison," Sarah replied calmly, "I've conducted dozens of building clearing operations during multiple deployments over the past several years. My experience includes both training scenarios and actual combat situations in various theaters of operation." Morrison wasn't satisfied with her answer and pressed further. "But how does your experience compare to that of male SEALs who've been conducting these operations for decades? Don't you think there's value in having tactics developed by people with extensive traditional combat experience?" Sarah realized that Morrison was trying to bait her into an emotional response that would make her appear unprofessional or overly sensitive. She also knew that his questions were inappropriate for a briefing setting and were clearly motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine professional interest. "Captain," Sarah said, maintaining her professional tone, "the tactics I'm presenting have been developed by a team of experienced operators from multiple special operations units. Our recommendations are based on extensive testing and analysis, not on any individual's personal experience." But Morrison continued his attack. "I'm just concerned that we're making tactical recommendations based on limited perspectives. Shouldn't these decisions be made by people who've proven themselves in traditional combat roles?" The room had become very quiet as other attendees realized they were witnessing a personal conflict playing out in a professional setting. Several senior officers looked uncomfortable with Morrison's behavior, but no one intervened to stop the inappropriate questioning. Sarah decided that she needed to address Morrison's behavior directly rather than continue to deflect his attacks. "Captain Morrison, your questions suggest that you have concerns about my qualifications and experience. If you'd like to discuss my record and credentials, I'd be happy to do so in a more appropriate setting. For now, I'd like to continue with the briefing that was scheduled for this time." Morrison seemed surprised by Sarah's direct response, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I think my questions are entirely appropriate for this setting. We're talking about tactics that could affect the lives of operators in the field. Don't you think we should have full confidence in the people making these recommendations?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the tension in the room. "I think the lieutenant commander has answered your questions sufficiently, Captain." Everyone turned to see who had spoken, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat when she saw a 4-star general standing at the back of the room. General Patricia Williams was one of the most senior officers in the Special Operations community, and her presence at the briefing was unexpected and significant. General Williams began walking toward the front of the room, her expression serious and her bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. As she moved through the room, officers instinctively straightened in their seats and focused their attention on her rather than on the conflict that had been unfolding. "Captain Morrison," General Williams said as she reached the front of the room, "your questions about Lieutenant Commander Martinez's qualifications are interesting, particularly given your own background." The general turned to address the entire room. "For those who may not be familiar with Lieutenant Commander Martinez's record, I'd like to share some information that might be relevant to Captain Morrison's concerns about experience and qualifications." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that General Williams was about to publicly address the situation. She appreciated the support, but she was also concerned about becoming the center of even more attention and controversy. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez has completed multiple deployments to high-threat areas over the past 5 years, General Williams continued. She has participated in over 40 direct action missions, including several that were classified as extremely high risk. Her performance evaluations consistently rate her as exceptional, and she has been recommended for several commendations for her actions under fire." The general's voice carried clearly throughout the room as she continued to detail Sarah's accomplishments. More recently, Lieutenant Commander Martinez led a classified operation that prevented a major terrorist attack and saved an estimated 200 civilian lives. The operation required 8 months of deep cover work in hostile territory and culminated in a successful intelligence-gathering mission that was completed despite significant enemy resistance. Sarah could see Morrison shifting uncomfortably in his seat as General Williams spoke. The detailed account of Sarah's record was making it clear that his questions about her qualifications had been completely unfounded and inappropriate. The lieutenant commander's current assignment to the Experimental Tactics Unit is based on her demonstrated expertise in tactical analysis and her proven ability to perform under pressure, General Williams continued. Her recommendations have been instrumental in identifying critical vulnerabilities in our current systems and developing solutions that will save lives in future operations. The general paused and looked directly at Morrison. "Captain, what is your combat experience? How many direct action missions have you conducted? What qualifications do you have that would allow you to question the tactical recommendations of someone with Lieutenant Commander Martinez's record?" Morrison's face had turned red as he realized that the general was turning his own questions back on him. "Ma'am, I've completed basic combat training and several stateside exercises." "I didn't mean to question." "You didn't mean to question her qualifications?" General Williams interrupted. "Because that's exactly what you've been doing, not just today but, apparently for several weeks now." Sarah realized that General Williams had been aware of the ongoing situation with Morrison and had chosen this moment to address it publicly. The general's intervention was sending a clear message to Morrison and to anyone else who might be harboring similar attitudes. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez," General Williams said, turning back to Sarah, "please continue with your presentation. I'm particularly interested in hearing about the urban warfare protocols your team has developed." As Sarah resumed her presentation, she could feel the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Morrison sat silent and subdued for the remainder of the briefing, while other attendees focused intently on Sarah's remarks. The general's intervention had effectively ended the harassment and established clearly that Sarah's presence and contributions were valued by the senior leadership. After Sarah completed her presentation, General Williams remained for the questions and discussion period. Several officers asked thoughtful questions about the Experimental Tactics Unit's work, and the discussion was professional and productive. Morrison did not participate in the discussion and left the briefing as soon as it concluded. When the briefing ended, General Williams approached Sarah as other attendees were filing out of the room. "Lieutenant Commander, I'd like to speak with you privately for a few minutes." Sarah followed the general to a small conference room adjacent to the main briefing area. Once they were alone, General Williams's demeanor became more personal and less formal. "I've been following your career for some time," the general said. "Your work with the Experimental Tactics Unit has been impressive, and your combat record speaks for itself. But I'm concerned about the harassment you've been facing from some quarters." Sarah appreciated the general's direct approach. "Ma'am, I've been dealing with skepticism and criticism throughout my career. It comes with the territory when you're breaking new ground." "That's true," General Williams agreed, "but there's a difference between healthy skepticism and targeted harassment. What Captain Morrison has been doing crosses that line, and it needed to be addressed." The general went on to explain that she had been receiving reports about the situation on the base for several weeks. Multiple sources had informed her about Morrison's inappropriate comments and his apparent campaign to undermine Sarah's credibility. The decision to intervene publicly was calculated to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated.